The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the day Georgia Atwood had already decided to stop trusting the world. She stood in the middle of the dirt road that cut through Harlow Creek, Kansas, in the spring of 1878, holding an envelope torn open at its edge, her fingers trembling not from cold but from a fury so deep and so long contained that it had become almost indistinguishable from grief. The letter was from her late husband's brother, a man named Corbin Atwood, and it said in plain legal language that the land she had been farming for 3 years, the 40 acres her husband Denton had promised would always be hers, had been signed over to Corbin by a deed she had never seen and had certainly never agreed to. The deed was dated 6 months before Denton died. The deed bore her husband's signature. She had been betrayed, not by a stranger, not by the land or the drought or the locusts that had taken 2 harvests before this one. She had been betrayed by a man she had slept beside, cooked for, planted beside, and buried in the red Kansas earth when the fever took him in November. And now she had 30 days to vacate the land. Georgia stood there long enough for Mrs. Haggerty from the dry goods store to pass by twice with obvious interest, and for the sheriff's deputy to tip his hat without meeting her eyes. The deputy knowing meant the whole town already knew. That was the nature of Harlow Creek. Secrets here had shorter lives than the wildflowers that pushed up through the cracked earth in May, and were gone by July. It was in that moment, standing in the road with the letter in her hand, and her whole future being methodically disassembled around her, that she looked up and saw Gilbert Finley watching her from across the street. He was leaning against the post outside the livery stable with his arms crossed and his hat pushed back slightly on his forehead, and he was not watching her the way the rest of Harlow Creek was watching her, with curiosity or with the thin, comfortable sympathy of people who were glad the catastrophe had chosen someone else this time. He was watching her the way a person watches something that matters, carefully, without performance. Like he was afraid to look away in case it got worse, and he had missed the moment when he could have helped. She had lived beside Gilbert Finley's property for 3 years and spoken to him perhaps 30 times in total. He was a quiet man, a deliberate man. He had come to Harlow Creek from somewhere in Missouri, people said, though no one knew the details and he did not offer them. He ran a modest cattle operation on 80 acres to the east of her land. He kept a clean fence line and paid his debts at the general store on the 1st of every month without fail. He was not her friend. He was not her enemy. He was her neighbor, and until this morning that had been the full extent of it. But something about the way he was looking at her from across that street, something steady and unperformed and almost pained, made Georgia Atwood feel for the first time in months like she was not entirely alone in the world. She looked away first. She folded the letter and put it in the pocket of her apron and walked back toward the farm, and she did not let herself cry until she was through the gate and out of sight of the road. She had not always been this alone, and the loneliness had not arrived all at once. It had come the way bad weather comes to the plains. So gradually, you almost convince yourself it is just a passing cloud. And then one morning you wake up and realize it has been overcast for so long you have forgotten what full sunlight looks like. Georgia had come to Kansas in 1873, 5 years prior, when she was 22 years old and newly married to Denton Atwood, who had been charming and full of plans, and had shown her the deed to the 40 acres with such pride that she had believed every word of the future he was selling her. They would build a good farm. They would grow their own food. They would have children and a real house and a place that was theirs. 2 of those 3 things had half happened. The farm was real, though it was modest and difficult. The house was more of a 2-room structure that leaked at the northeast corner when it rained hard, but it stood. The children had never come, and by year 2 she and Denton had stopped talking about them, and by year 3 she had understood that the silence around that subject was not grief, but rather a mutual decision neither of them had formally made. Denton had not been cruel. He had not been a bad man in the obvious ways. He had been absent. Present in body and largely absent in everything else, more interested in the saloon's backroom poker games than the fields, more attached to whatever vision of himself he had arrived with than whatever truth the land was showing him. Georgia had quietly taken over the real farming work, learning as she went, failing and adjusting, developing a competence she had not known she possessed, and a stubbornness that was simply the practical face of survival. When Denton died in November of 1877, Georgia had wept genuinely, because she was not a cold woman, and because death deserves weeping regardless of the fullness of a marriage. And then she had gone back to work the next morning. The farm was a source of corn mostly, with a kitchen garden alongside. The corn was what paid for salt and flour and the occasional new tool. The corn was what she understood. She had learned the soil of those 40 acres the way you learn a language, by immersion and repetition and mistake, until it stopped being foreign and started being an extension of her own thinking. And now Corbin Atwood wanted to take it. She spent the first night after receiving the letter in a state that was something between paralysis and fury, unable to eat and unable to sleep, sitting at the kitchen table with the oil lamp turned low and the letter spread out in front of her like a wound. Corbin Atwood was 3 years younger than Denton and shared none of his limited charm. He had come through Harlow Creek once, 2 years before Denton died, and Georgia had found him to be the kind of man who looked at property the way other men looked at women, with a calculating assessment of worth and a mental calculation of how to acquire it. He had looked at her farm with those eyes. She had noticed at the time and filed it away, and then, as you do with threats you cannot immediately address, she had let herself mostly forget it. She had not been careful enough. She had not been watching for the dark past of a legal trap set in quiet. The forced choice before her now was simple in structure and brutal in reality. She could leave, or she could fight. To fight required money she did not have, and a lawyer she could not afford, and a legal system that in 1878 Kansas was not particularly inclined to rule in favor of a widowed woman against a man with a deed. To leave meant 30 years of nothing. It meant that everything she had built, every row she had turned, every season she had fought through, had been for a life she was being forced to vacate. On the second morning after the letter, she did not decide anything consciously. She simply went out to the eastern edge of the property, the long strip of ground she had been preparing for the past 2 weeks, and she started planting her first row of corn. It was a Thursday, the 22nd of April, 1878. The ground was warm enough and the risk of frost had passed, and the soil, which she had turned and loosened and enriched over 3 seasons of work, was as ready as soil can be. She had a sack of seed corn over her shoulder, the good variety she had selected carefully from last season's harvest, the kernels she had dried and stored through the winter. She was planting corn she did not legally own the right to plant on land that had been taken from under her, and she was doing it anyway, because she did not know what else to do, and because sometimes the only way to answer a betrayal is to keep doing the true thing. She had been at it for perhaps 20 minutes, working the row with methodical care, pressing each seed to the right depth, spacing them with an attention that was almost meditative, when she became aware that she was being watched. She straightened and turned, and Gilbert Finley was standing at the fence line between his property and hers. He was not leaning the way he had been in town. He was standing straight, hat in his hand at his side, and he was watching her plant corn with an expression that Georgia could not immediately categorize. It was not pity. It was not the uncomfortable sympathy of someone who has heard bad news about another person and does not know where to put his face. It was something quieter and deeper than that. Something that looked, she thought, almost like reverence. Like the act of a woman pressing seeds into contested earth was something worth bearing witness to. Like it was sacred. He stood there for a long moment without speaking. Georgia looked at him steadily, not hiding what she was doing, not apologizing for it. Then he said quietly, "I heard about the deed." "So did everyone," she said. "I'm sorry about it. Corbin Atwood is the one who should be sorry." "He won't be," Gilbert said. Men like that have trained themselves out of it. She turned back to her row. She pressed another seed into the earth. She heard the fence creak slightly as he rested his arms on the top rail, and she understood that he was staying, not intruding, staying. "You're going to plant the whole row," he said after a while. It wasn't a question. "And the next one," she said, "and the one after that." There was a silence that was not uncomfortable. A red-tailed hawk crossed the sky above them going south. "What will you do?" he said, "about Corbin?" "I don't know yet," she said honestly, "but I'm not leaving." She heard him exhale slowly, the way a person exhales when they have been holding their breath for longer than they realized. "All right," he said, just that. "All right." She did not look at him again that morning, but she was aware of him the entire time she worked, the way you are aware of the sun even when you are not facing it. He stood at that fence for over an hour, saying nothing else, watching her plant her first row of corn. When she finally reached the end of the row and turned, he was still there. "The lawyer in Salina is a man named Thaddeus Prout," Gilbert said. "He handled a deed dispute for a family north of here 4 years back. He's honest and he's thorough, and he will look at your case before he charges you anything." Georgia looked at him for a long moment. "Why are you telling me this?" Gilbert held her gaze without wavering. "Because someone should have told you sooner," he said, and he put his hat back on and walked back to his own property. And Georgia Atwood stood at the end of her first row of corn and felt something shift in her chest that she could not entirely name. She wrote to Thaddeus Prout in Salina that same evening. The response came in 9 days. Prout said the deed was suspicious in several respects, and he would like to see the original documents, and would she be able to travel to Salina or have the papers sent. He charged $2 for an initial consultation, which was money she had but not money she had casually. She went to Gilbert Finley's door the following Saturday morning, because she had decided that if she was going to accept help she would do it directly and without pretense. He answered the door in his work clothes, clearly in the middle of something, a slight surprise on his face that resolved immediately into a quiet attentiveness. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Come in," he said, and stepped back. His house was modest and clean, which matched what she expected of him. There was a wood stove and a table and 2 chairs and a shelf of books that surprised her. She stood in the middle of the room without sitting down. "The lawyer needs papers," she said. "I have them, but I have to get to Salina and I can't leave the farm unattended for the time it would take, and I can't afford to hire the boarding at Salina and the stage fare both." She stopped. "I'm asking if you would watch the farm. Feed the chickens and make sure nothing burns down, 3 days at most." He nodded slowly. "I can do that." "I'll pay you when I'm back," she said. "You won't," he said. "This isn't work. This is neighboring." She stared at him. "You're a difficult man to negotiate with." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile but the near neighbor of one. "You're not the first person to tell me that." She left for Salina on Monday morning, riding the twice-weekly stage out of Harlow Creek, with the deed documents and 3 years of tax receipts in a leather satchel. She arrived in Salina by evening, took a room at a respectable boarding house on 2nd Street that cost 65 cents a night, and met with Thaddeus Prout the following morning. Prout was a compact, bespectacled man in his 50s with the air of someone who had been made slightly disappointed by the world, but had decided to be professionally useful about it. He read her documents with the focused silence of a man who is genuinely thinking, and Georgia sat across from him at his desk and waited, because she had learned that patience was a tool as real as a spade. After 40 minutes, Prout set the papers down and folded his hands. "The deed is dated October of 1877, he said. "Your husband died November 4th of that year. Is that correct?" "Yes." "The deed bears his signature, but there are 2 witnesses listed. Do you know either of these men?" "A Gerald Foss and a man listed only as T.W. Hayes," she thought. "Gerald Foss worked at the feed store in Harlow Creek for a time. I don't know a Hayes." "Gerald Foss is listed as a witness to the signature, which means he would have to testify that he personally saw Denton Atwood sign this document. If he didn't, or if he was coerced into signing as witness, the deed has a foundational problem. Pruitt tapped the paper. Furthermore, in Kansas, a deed conveying marital property requires both spousal signatures if the property was acquired during the marriage. This deed has only your husband's name. Georgia felt something catch in her throat. He didn't have the right to sign it away without me. Under Kansas law as written, no. The question is whether a court will enforce that protection for a widow. Pruitt paused. It is not a certainty, but you have grounds, Mrs. Atwood, real ones. She rode the stage back to Harlow Creek on Wednesday with Pruitt's written opinion in her satchel and a precise plan of action for contesting the deed filed at the county courthouse in Ellsworth. The legal fight would take months. It would cost more money than she currently had. It would require her to find and compel Gerald Foss to testify honestly, which was not guaranteed. But she had grounds, real ones. When she arrived back at the farm that evening, there was a light in her kitchen window, and she walked in to find Gilbert Finley sitting at her kitchen table with a lantern and one of his books, having apparently decided that watching the farm included being present in it. He looked up without embarrassment. "The brown hen was trying to nest outside the coop," he said. "I put her back twice. Third time she cooperated." "Thank you," Georgia said. She set her satchel on the table. "How did it go?" She told him. She told him all of it, the deed's legal weakness, the requirement for both signatures, the need for Gerald Foss, the cost of the court filing, and the continued legal work. She talked for longer than she had talked to another person in months, and Gilbert listened with the kind of total attention that she had almost forgotten existed, not waiting for his turn to speak, not preparing a response, just receiving what she was saying as completely as ground receives rain. When she finished, he said, "Gerald Foss still lives here. He's over on Wheeler Street. He drinks at the Harlow Creek Saloon on Friday evenings." She looked at him. "You know him?" "I know most people in this town," Gilbert said simply. "I've been here 6 years." She hadn't known that, 6 years, longer than her. "Why haven't you ever said much to me?" There was a brief pause, not the pause of a person searching for a lie, but the pause of a person deciding how much truth to offer. "I didn't think you wanted much company," he said. "You and Denton seemed like you had your own situation, and then after he passed, it seemed like you were working something out." She considered this. It was perceptive. It was not what most people had done, which was show up with casseroles and unsolicited advice. He had given her space that she had not thought to be grateful for because she had not known it was a deliberate gift. "What changed?" she asked. "In town, when you were watching, at the fence, what made you decide to say something?" He looked at her for a moment with that steady quality she was beginning to understand was not blankness but concentration, a man fully present in a conversation. "You were planting," he said, "on land that someone was trying to take from you. You didn't argue with it or rage at it or collapse. You just planted. I thought something like that deserved to be witnessed." He paused. "And I thought you'd been alone with it long enough." Georgia felt the back of her eyes go warm, and she looked away quickly at the window, because she was not going to cry in front of Gilbert Finley on a Wednesday evening. Not yet. "The legal costs," she said, keeping her voice even. "Pruitt estimates $8 to $12 for the full process if it goes to a hearing. I have 6. If the corn comes in well, I'll have more by August, but the hearing might be scheduled before then." "I'll lend you $6, he said immediately. "I'm not taking, it's a loan," he said, and his voice had a quiet firmness that was not aggressive but was very clear. "With no interest and no deadline. If you win the case, pay it back when you can. If you lose, consider it a neighbor contributing to a fight that was worth fighting." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. He did not drop his eyes, and he did not soften the offer into something more palatable or less direct. "All right," she said. The word felt like something returning. The following Friday, Georgia went to find Gerald Foss. She found him exactly where Gilbert had predicted, at a corner table in the Harlow Creek Saloon, a gaunt man in his late 40s who looked like he had been weathering something internal for a long time and not particularly winning. She sat down across from him without being invited and put the deed on the table. Foss looked at it. He looked at her. The color went from his face in a way that answered several questions before she had asked any. "You know what this is," she said. "I don't want trouble," he said. "Neither do I," she said. "I want the truth." "Corbin Atwood brought this to you and asked you to sign it as a witness, didn't he? And either Denton wasn't there when you signed, or Denton was there but didn't truly understand what he was signing." Foss picked up his glass and then set it down again without drinking. "Corbin Atwood is not a man you want problems with," he said. "I already have problems with him," Georgia said. "He has my farm, I'd like it back." She leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Foss, I have a lawyer in Salina who believes this deed is invalid. If you testify honestly about what happened when this document was signed, you're not creating trouble. You're undoing something that was already crooked." The silence between them stretched. The saloon was noisy around them, the kind of ambient noise that actually provides privacy. "He told me it was a family arrangement," Foss said finally, not meeting her eyes. "That you and Denton had agreed to it and it was just paperwork. Denton was sick by then. He signed things. He wasn't reading much anymore. He stopped. I shouldn't have done it." "No," Georgia said without cruelty. "But you can do something different now." It took 2 more conversations and the written assurance of Thaddeus Prout that Foss's testimony, given voluntarily, would be treated by the court as cooperative, before Gerald Foss agreed to provide a sworn statement. Georgia brought the news to Gilbert on a Sunday afternoon, walking across to his fence line the way she had begun to do when something significant happened, a habit that had formed without her quite deciding to form it. He was mending a section of fence when she arrived, and he listened to her account of the conversation with Foss without stopping his work, his hands moving steadily on the wire while his attention was entirely on her words. When she finished, he said, "That was well done." "I was terrified," she said. "You didn't look it." "I've gotten good at that," she said, and there was something rueful in her voice that made him stop what he was doing and look at her properly. "How long have you been doing that?" he asked, not looking terrified when you are. The question was so direct and so genuinely curious, not judgmental, not pitying, that it caught her slightly off balance. She thought about it honestly. "Since I came to Kansas," she said. "Maybe before. My father ran a farm in Ohio. There wasn't much room for looking frightened." "What did your father think of you coming out here?" "He thought Denton was a good prospect," she said. "He wasn't wrong exactly. The land was real. The plans just never quite solidified." They walked together along the fence line without deciding to walk, and the afternoon light was the specific gold of late Kansas spring that made everything look temporarily like a painting. Georgia noticed it and then noticed that she was noticing it, which felt like a small recovery of something she had let go of. "What brought you to Kansas?" she asked him. "People say Missouri." "People are right," he said. "I had a farm there, small. After my father died, I couldn't make it pay. Sold it and came west looking for better ground. Any family? A sister in St. Louis, we write." He paused. "Nothing else." She understood the nothing else without needing it explained. She had her own version of it. They had reached the corner of the property, where a single old cottonwood stood at the intersection of their fence lines, and they stopped there because the tree was shady and the afternoon was warm and neither of them seemed to be in a hurry. "The corn is looking good," he said, glancing toward her field. "It needs rain," she said, "but not immediately. The soil's holding." "Your soil is better than mine on the west side," he said, with no resentment, just observation. "You've been working it longer." "3 seasons of manure and patience," she said, and he laughed, an actual full laugh that she had not heard from him before, and it changed his whole face, made him look younger and more open and like someone who had always had that laugh available and just hadn't used it much. She found herself smiling back before she thought about it. The legal process moved through May and into June. The hearing at the Ellsworth County Courthouse was scheduled for the 14th of July, and in the weeks leading up to it, Georgia and Gilbert developed a rhythm that neither of them acknowledged explicitly, but that both of them were aware of. She brought him tomatoes from her kitchen garden because she had too many and he had none. He brought her information, small, useful pieces of it. The name of a man who had won a similar deed dispute in Abilene the previous year. A note that Gilbert Atwood had been seen in Harlow Creek the previous week, likely scoping the property. She told him about Corbin's visit to the farm. Corbin had appeared at her gate on a Thursday morning, well-dressed and affecting a cordiality so thin it was nearly transparent, and had said that he hoped she was thinking carefully about her situation, and that he would be willing to give her an additional 30 days to find alternative accommodations, as a courtesy. She had looked at him over the gate with her hands dirty from the morning's work and said, "I have a lawyer and I have a hearing date, and I have no interest in your courtesy." She had told Gilbert this story while they were both leaning on the cottonwood fence corner, and the way his jaw moved when she described Corbin's expression in response to her answer, something that was almost fierce satisfaction, made her feel that she was not just tolerated but genuinely championed, and that feeling was one she had almost forgotten existed. It was on a Saturday in late June, about 2.5 weeks before the hearing, that something shifted between them in a way that couldn't be shifted back. She had been having a difficult day. The kind of day that is not caused by any single catastrophic event, but simply accumulates from small things: a torn seed bag, a loose hinge on the coupe, a letter from Prout asking for clarification on a document she had to search through Denton's papers to find, which meant going through Denton's papers, which was its own quiet excavation of a marriage that had been both real and insufficient. She found herself sitting on the porch step in the late afternoon with her hands in her lap and nothing particularly left in her. She heard his boots on the path before she saw him, the familiar rhythm of them on the packed dirt. He came around the corner of the house and stopped when he saw her face. He didn't say anything immediately. He sat down on the step beside her, which was a thing he had not done before, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. They sat in silence for a while. "Denton's papers," she said eventually. "Ah," he said. "He wasn't a terrible man," she said, which was something she had needed to say to someone for a very long time. "But he wasn't enough. And I spent 3 years pretending I was okay with that because I didn't know what the alternative was. And now I'm still here and he's gone and I'm defending the farm he tried to give away, and I don't even know if I'm angry at him or sad or what." "You can be both," Gilbert said. "They're not in competition." She looked at him sideways. He was looking straight ahead at the evening light over the cornfield, and his profile was very still. "You're easier to talk to than anyone I've ever known," she said, with a slight bewilderment in her voice, as though this were a fact she was encountering for the first time and needed to report accurately. He turned and looked at her then, and there was something in his eyes that she had been sensing for weeks but hadn't let herself look at directly until now, something that was not casual neighborliness and was not practical generosity and was not simply the decency of a good man. "Georgia," he said very quietly. "Don't," she said, and then immediately, "No, I don't mean don't, I mean," she stopped. She pressed her hands flat on her knees. "I mean I'm 37 days away from a legal hearing that will determine whether I still have a home, and I am trying very hard to keep everything in the correct order." 37 days is a long time," he said. "Not particularly," she said, but she was smiling slightly in spite of herself, the way you smile when someone has caught you in a small inconsistency, and you know it. He was smiling too, the same quiet near smile she had come to recognize as the outer edge of his full one. They sat on the step until the light was gone. He did not leave immediately after that, and she did not ask him to. The 14th of July arrived on a day of proper summer heat that pressed down on Harlow Creek like a weight. Georgia wore her best dress, a practical dark wool that was too warm for July but was the most serious thing she owned, and she rode the stage to Ellsworth with her documents in the satchel and Gerald Foss's sworn statement folded neatly in its own envelope. Thaddeus Prout met her outside the courthouse at 8:30. Gilbert Atwood arrived 20 minutes later with his own lawyer, a tall man from Wichita whose very good suit was its own form of argument. Gilbert had come too, riding his own horse to Ellsworth that morning, arriving before her, standing outside the courthouse when her stage pulled in. He said nothing when he saw her, just met her eyes and nodded once, and that single nod contained more steadying force than any speech could have. He sat in the gallery of the hearing room, and she felt him there without looking. The hearing before Judge Elias Morrow lasted 4 hours, which was 2 more than Pruitt had predicted. Corbin's lawyer was skilled and persistent, and for the first hour Georgia was genuinely frightened. He argued that the deed was signed voluntarily by a competent adult, that no law required a wife's co-signature for property held in the husband's name, and that Georgia's 3-year residence on the land was a matter of marital arrangement, not legal ownership. Then Pruitt put Gerald Foss on the stand, and Gerald Foss, visibly trembling but methodically honest, testified that Denton Atwood had signed the deed while suffering from the fever that would kill him 5 weeks later, that Corbin had told him the document was a simple family financial arrangement with the wife's knowledge and agreement, and that Georgia had never been consulted or present. Corbin's lawyer attacked Foss's credibility for 30 minutes, with the kind of precision that made Georgia's hands tighten in her lap. Then Pruitt introduced the Kansas law regarding marital property acquired during marriage, his argument clean and specific. The property had been acquired by both parties during the marriage. The wife's signature should have been obtained. The deed was therefore legally deficient on its face regardless of Denton's state of health. Judge Morrow was a slow-moving man who chewed the end of his pen while thinking, and he was silent for a long time after both sides concluded. Then he ruled. The deed was invalid. The property reverted to the estate of Denton Atwood. As the surviving spouse, Georgia Atwood was the sole heir of the estate. The 40 acres were hers. She sat very still for a moment after the words landed. Then she stood and her legs were steady, and she thanked Thaddeus Pruitt and shook his hand, and she turned to look at Gilbert in the gallery, and the expression on his face was not surprise, because she thought he had believed she would win, but something that was relief made enormous, joy held in careful check. He met her outside on the courthouse steps. The July heat was full and blazing on the stone. "It's yours," he said. "It was always mine," she said, and there was something fierce and clean in her voice that made him reach out and take her hand briefly, just once, and then let go. The contact was brief and deliberate, and said something that neither of them was quite ready to say in full yet. They rode back to Harlow Creek on the same stage, her horse tied to the back, and they sat side by side in the rumbling coach, their shoulders touching with the sway of the road, and the silence between them was the warm, particular silence of 2 people who are saving something for when they arrive somewhere that belongs to them. The summer deepened, and the corn grew. Georgia was in the field every morning by first light, working the rows, watching the stalks with a focused joy that she recognized as something different from the grim determination she had worked with before. There was still hard work and there was still exhaustion, but underneath all of it was the settled certainty of ownership. The land was hers, and nothing was trying to take it, and she had fought for it and won. Gilbert was around with a frequency that had long since stopped being surprising. He helped her repair the sagging section of the south fence without being asked, appeared one morning with a used but functional hay rake that he said he had acquired as part of a trade and had no use for. She cooked dinner for them both twice a week, first out of gratitude and then out of habit, and then out of something more honest than either of those. They talked about everything. She told him about growing up in Ohio, about a father who was demanding but proud of her in a way he expressed by assigning her more work, about a mother who had died when Georgia was 14 and whose absence had shaped her in ways she was still understanding. He told her about Missouri, about a father who had built something and a mother who had made that something worth coming home to, about the specific loneliness of the first winter in Kansas when he had not known anyone and the plains wind had a quality unlike anything he had known, and he had spent 2 weeks in January almost entirely inside before he decided that loneliness was something you had to walk into rather than shelter from. She told him that she had never loved Denton the way she had expected to love someone when she agreed to marry him, that she had married the plan as much as the man, and the plan had been seductive because it was specific: the land, the farm, the independence, the distance from a life in Ohio that had started to feel like a box she was expected to stay inside, that she did not regret coming to Kansas, only some of how she had arrived. He listened to all of this with his characteristic total attention, and then he said, "For what it's worth, the farm is better for your having run it. Anyone who knows land can see that." "That's a practical compliment," she said. "I'm a practical man," he said, "but I mean it more than practically." She looked at him across the dinner table, the oil lamp between them, the sounds of the summer Kansas night coming through the open window. He was looking at her with that expression she had learned by now, focused and still and containing a great deal that he managed carefully. "Gilbert," she said. "Georgia," he said, and the way he said her name, the particular weight he gave it, like it was something he had been saying privately for a long time and was only now saying aloud, made the breath catch in her chest. She reached across the table and put her hand on top of his. He turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat like that for a long moment in the lamplight, the corn rustling softly outside in a night breeze. "I'm not going to pretend I don't know what this is," she said. "I'm done pretending things are simpler than they are." "I know what it is," he said. "I've known for a while." "Since when?" she asked, genuinely curious. He thought for a moment. "Since the fence," he said. "When you were planting, I couldn't account for how watching you work felt. It seemed important to stay." She tightened her hand around his. "You stood there for over an hour," she said. "I noticed." "I thought you might," he said. "I kept expecting you to say something useful about farming." "I didn't want to interrupt," he said, and there was something in his voice that was both self-deprecating and entirely sincere, and she laughed, a full, real laugh that surprised her with its ease. He was smiling too, the full smile she had been collecting the sightings of all summer, and in the lamplight with his hand warm around hers and the corn outside and the farm that was hers stretching out into the July night, Georgia Atwood understood with great clarity that she had spent years building the right life in the wrong circumstances, and that the circumstances had just materially improved. The kiss was not dramatic. There was no sweeping gesture, no moment of theatrical overcome. She leaned forward across the table and he met her halfway, and it was quiet and certain, and felt exactly like something that had been true for a while arriving at last in the present tense. The rest of the summer was the best she had known in Kansas. They did not rush. There was a courtship in the real sense, deliberate and unhurried and full of the small pleasures of two people who have both been alone long enough to know what company is worth. He brought her wildflowers once, the purple ones that grew along the creek bottom, presented with a straightforwardness that made her feel he had brought them because he wanted to, and not because some convention demanded it. She wrote him a letter once, not for any particular occasion, simply because she had been thinking something in the field and wanted to say it more fully than a passing conversation would allow, and she left it folded against his door, and he kept it, she found out later, in his shirt pocket for a week. They argued too, which was a comfort in its way. He was sometimes too self-sufficient to the point of stubbornness, inclined to handle things alone that could have been handled jointly. She was occasionally too direct in her assessments of a situation, too quick to name the hard thing when a moment's patience might have softened it. They had one real argument in August about the practicalities of combining their operations. He had suggested it as a future possibility, and she had responded with a sharpness that was not really about the suggestion, but about the fear underneath it, the fear of something built disappearing again into someone else's decisions. He had been quiet for a moment after her sharpness, and then he had said, "Georgia, I'm not suggesting you give anything up. I'm suggesting we add to what both of us have. Those are different proposals." She had known he was right immediately, but she had needed a few minutes to get there, and when she came back to him with that honesty, he received it without any triumph, just the steady acceptance of a man who understood that trust is built from exactly these moments of recovering from the fear of it. The harvest came in late August and into September, and it was good. The best she had brought in. The corn was strong and the yield was higher than any previous season, which she attributed to the work of the previous 3 years all arriving together in one productive season, the way things sometimes do, patience assembling itself into result. She was in the field on the last day of corn harvest, the stalks dry and golden in the September light, when she looked up and saw Gilbert at the fence again. The same fence, the eastern boundary. He was standing the same way he had stood on that April morning, hat in his hand, watching her. But everything was different now. She was not planting against dispossession. She was harvesting what she had won. And he was not a near stranger holding his distance. He was the man she loved, and she knew that word applied with a precision and a fullness that she had not previously experienced, that she would have been careful about naming for the risk of being wrong, except that she had been watching it arrive all summer and was very sure. She walked to the fence. He was smiling when she got there, the full one. "Good harvest," he said. "The best," she said. "Come help me finish." He climbed the fence, which he could simply have walked around to the gate, but he climbed it quickly and easily, and landed on her side of it, and she handed him the harvesting knife, and they worked side by side through the last of the afternoon until the whole field was done. That evening, sitting on her porch in the cooling September air with the harvested field stretching out in front of them, dark and spent and satisfied looking the way a worked field always is at the end of a good season, Gilbert said, "I want to ask you something." She waited. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "And I want to be clear that I'm asking because I love you and because I would like to spend the rest of my life next to you. Not because it's practical, not because it makes farming sense, because you're the person I want." Georgia looked at him for a long time in the early dark, the September stars beginning to show above the flat horizon. "I love you too," she said, which she had not said yet in those specific words, and saying it felt like releasing something that had been held too long, like the first deep breath after a long descent. "And yes, I'm saying yes." He leaned over and kissed her once, with the same quiet certainty as the first time, and she put her hand against his cheek, and they sat on the porch looking at her corn field, which was her corn field, and the night spread out over the Kansas plains in all its enormous, indifferent beauty, and for once Georgia Atwood did not feel small inside it. They were married in October, on a Tuesday, which had been the day Georgia received the letter that had started everything, and she had chosen it deliberately because she wanted to make something different out of Tuesdays. The ceremony was held at the Harlow Creek Church, presided over by the Reverend Carwell, a decent man who kept the service brief and genuine. There were perhaps 20 people present, the Haggertys from the dry goods store, the Prout family who had made the trip from Salina, Gerald Foss who stood in the back with an expression that suggested he was glad things had worked out and slightly relieved to have a small part in that. A handful of other neighbors. Georgia wore a cream-colored dress she had made herself from fabric she had ordered from the catalog, a practical project she had worked on in the evenings through September, which had given her hands something to do with the anticipation. She carried the purple wildflowers, not from Gilbert this time, but ones she had gathered herself from the creek bottom that morning, because she wanted to bring them herself. Gilbert wore his good dark coat, which he had clearly pressed that morning, and when she walked to the front of the church and he turned to look at her, the expression on his face was the fullest she had ever seen him, something that did not fit in a single name, love and relief and recognition, and a joy so settled it did not require any performance. Reverend Carwell read the vows. They said them in turn, looking at each other without looking away. After the ceremony, Mrs. Haggerty produced a cake from somewhere, which was unexpected and excellent, and they all stood in the churchyard in the October sun and ate it, and Georgia stood beside Gilbert with his hand in hers and felt, at last and fully and without reservation, that she was in the right place. They combined the farms in the practical sense that winter, not by merging deeds immediately, but by working them as a single operation. The cattle and the crops and the shared labor of two people who were both good at different things and genuinely interested in what the other knew. Georgia's 40 acres remained in her name. She had been clear about that, and Gilbert had been clear that he agreed, not as a compromise but as a principle. What she had fought for remained hers. What they built together would be theirs. The first full winter of their marriage was also the hardest winter Kansas had seen in several years, which felt both like bad luck and like the kind of testing that could have been designed. A blizzard in January came down from the north with 4 days of warning, and arrived anyway with more force than the warning had suggested. They lost 3 cattle. The coop roof collapsed under snow weight and had to be reconstructed in brutally cold conditions, their hands in gloves that were never quite warm enough, working by the light of 2 lanterns while the storm raged outside. Through all of it, Georgia noticed something she had not expected about sharing difficult things with someone who was fully present. The hardship did not disappear, but it divided, in the precise mathematical sense, between 2 people instead of resting on one. When she was discouraged, he was steady. When he was frustrated with the losses, she was practical and problem-focused. They fit the difficulties the way their hands fit together, with a complementarity that was not accidental. By February, when the worst of the winter broke and the plains showed the first bare patches of brown earth through the snow, she was aware that she was happy in a way that she had not planned for, that was not cautious or conditional, that was simply present and real. She was also, by February, fairly certain she was pregnant. She confirmed it with the confidence of a woman who knew her own body from years of close attention, and she sat with the knowledge for a week before she told Gilbert, not because she was uncertain about how he would receive it, but because she wanted a week of carrying it privately first, the way she had always processed large things, alone initially and then together. She told him on a Sunday evening after dinner, simply and directly. "I think we're going to have a child," she said. "By August, I think." He was absolutely still for a moment, the way a landscape is still in the second before a significant wind, and then he reached across and pulled her toward him and held on with a completeness that was not dramatic but was entirely real. "Are you well?" he asked, pulling back to look at her properly. "Perfectly well," she said. "I feel very well, actually." "Good," he said, and then, "good" again, and he was not a man who repeated himself, which told her what she needed to know about the scope of what he was feeling. She wrote to her father in Ohio, the first substantial letter she had written home in 2 years. She told him about the legal fight and its outcome, about Gilbert, about the marriage, about the coming child. Her father's response arrived 6 weeks later, a letter that was not effusive but was warm in the way her father's warmth always expressed itself, through careful practicality, and a final line that said he was glad she had found her ground. Thaddeus Prout wrote to congratulate them on the marriage, having heard from someone, and enclosed a small book of Kansas legal statutes as a wedding gift, which Gilbert found genuinely funny and Georgia appreciated sincerely. Corbin Atwood was not heard from again. Georgia was told by the Harlow Creek deputy in the spring that Corbin had left the area, moving south toward Texas, and she received this information with an equanimity that was neither forgiveness nor continued anger, but simply the closing of a chapter. He was gone. The farm was hers. The story he had tried to write for her had not stuck. Spring came back to the farm in its particular Kansas way, sudden and extravagant after the long winter, the green coming up all at once as though it had been waiting at the door. Georgia planted her corn again in late April, moving more slowly now with the pregnancy but not stopping, working the rows she knew by heart, pressing the same good variety of seed into the same carefully tended soil. Gilbert, she noticed, stood at the fence again on the first morning of planting. She noticed him and she straightened and turned, and their eyes met, and she said, "Are you going to watch from there again?" "I thought I'd stay on this side of the fence this time," he said, and he was already smiling, and he walked over and held out his hand for the seed bag, and she gave it to him, and they planted the first row together. The son was born in early August, on a morning of such particular Kansas heat that the air had a shimmer to it. He arrived loudly and healthily, delivered by the town's capable midwife Mrs. Crane, while Gilbert paced the outside of the house in a state that he would later describe as composed, and that Mrs. Crane, reporting later to Mrs. Haggerty, described as nearly frantic. Georgia, from her post inside the house, could hear his boots on the porch boards. When Mrs. Crane brought him in and put the child in her arms, she felt something open in her chest that she had not known was closed, something that had been waiting a long time. Gilbert came in when he was permitted to, which was about 4 minutes after the birth, and he stood at the edge of the room looking at them both with an expression so entirely unguarded that Georgia felt she was seeing him as fully as she had ever seen anyone. He came and sat beside her on the bed, and he looked at the child, who was red-faced and emphatic and clearly intending to have opinions about the world. "He looks like he's got things to say," Gilbert said. "Good," Georgia said. "He should." They named him Thomas, after no one in particular, and both of them finding it right when they said it aloud. Thomas was a vocal and interested child who slept better than Georgia had feared, and who by 4 months had a look of focused curiosity on his face that reminded her strongly of his father, the same quality of watching the world as though it were a problem worth solving. Gilbert was a present father in the same way he was present in everything, fully and without performance. He was up at night when the child needed it, calm in the way that was useful rather than passive, certain in the small technical challenges of infancy in a way that suggested he had thought carefully about it. The year moved through its seasons, and Georgia's farm, which by now they thought of as their farm while continuing to honor the legal distinction that had cost her so much to establish, prospered in a way that felt earned precisely because it was. The corn was good. The cattle were stable. They added a small dairy operation in the second year, 3 cows bought at a fair price from a retiring farmer south of town, which added milk and butter and cheese to their self-sufficiency and a modest additional income. They put a new roof on the house the following spring, a proper one that did not leak at the northeast corner, and Georgia stood outside and watched it go up with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who has replaced something temporary with something built to last. Harlow Creek changed around them in the ways that small Kansas towns changed in the late 1870s and into the 1880s. The arrival of the railroad spur in 1880, which brought new people and new commerce, and a general store expansion that meant you could order things in weeks instead of months. The town became slightly less raw and slightly more established, and Gilbert and Georgia occupied a particular position in it. Not the oldest residents and not the newest, but among the most respected, known as people who did what they said and who had demonstrated, in Georgia's case quite publicly, the capacity to hold a position under pressure. Gerald Foss had moved out of Harlow Creek by 1879, and Georgia heard later that he had gone to live with a brother in Colorado. She thought of him occasionally without malice, a man who had done a wrong thing out of fear and then done the harder thing when given the chance, and she believed in her practical way that people's full account should include both. In the autumn of 1880, Georgia found herself pregnant again. Thomas was just past 2 years old, walking with great purpose, and already demonstrating a relationship to physical objects that was very much his father's, picking things up and examining them with total seriousness before deciding what to do with them. This second pregnancy was easier in the early months and harder in the later ones, and by the time she was deep into the 3rd trimester, she was working the farm with a stubbornness that made Gilbert quietly anxious and that she was aware of and was not particularly inclined to moderate. "I'm not ill," she told him more than once. "I'm pregnant. There's a difference." "I know there's a difference," he said. "I'd just feel better if you weren't lifting the full feed bags." "I'm not lifting the full feed bags," she said, which was technically true. She was lifting them from one side, which was a different thing. The second child was a daughter, born in February of 1881, in the middle of a night that was remarkably calm for February in Kansas. She arrived more quietly than Thomas had, slipping into the world with a composure that Mrs. Crane said she had rarely seen in a newborn, alert and observant from the first minutes. They named her Clara. She had Georgia's coloring, and already in her first weeks, a look of steady assessment about her that belonged to both of them. Thomas regarded his sister with a 2-year-old's mixture of fascination and suspicion that resolved, over the following months, into a devoted and slightly possessive affection. He was very invested in reporting on her status. "Clara is sleeping. Clara made a noise. Clara has my spoon," which was always reported as a catastrophe. Georgia, nursing Clara on the porch one April evening while Thomas played in the dirt nearby and the last light stretched long and gold over the cornfield, had a thought that arrived fully formed, the way significant thoughts sometimes do. She had planted her first row of corn on this farm under the shadow of its potential loss, her hands in the earth and her jaw set, and everything she had built at risk. She had done it because she did not know what else to do with herself, and because the land was the truest thing she had. She still did not know a truer thing than the land, except for the man who had stood at the fence and witnessed it. She looked up and Gilbert was there, coming from the direction of the barn, Thomas running toward him at the undignified full tilt of a 2-year-old with something urgent to report. And he caught Thomas and swung him up and settled him on his hip with the easy practice of a man who had been doing it for 2 years. And then his eyes came to her on the porch, and he walked toward her with that steadiness that had been the first thing she trusted about him. And he sat down beside her, Thomas between them. Clara in her arms, the evening spreading out. "Good day," he said. "Very good," she said. They sat there in the evening in the specific quiet of two people who have nothing left to hide from each other and everything still to say. And the Kansas sky above them went from gold to rose to that deep particular blue that falls over the plains before the stars come out. The blue that looks like it goes all the way to the end of something, and perhaps it does. The cornfield stood in the late spring air, not yet planted for the season, waiting. The soil was ready. Tomorrow she would begin the first row, and the season would start again. And it would start with the farm fully hers and her family around her and the ground beneath her feet, exactly as known and familiar as her own name. That was what she had fought for in the end, not just the land in the legal sense, but this, the accumulated and specific reality of a life that was genuinely her own. Not a life she had married into or moved toward or performed. A life she had planted and tended and defended, and then watched come in, again and again, season after season, the way good ground does when it is understood and respected and worked by hands that know it. And Gilbert, who had watched her begin that planting from the fence on a Thursday morning in April of 1878, who had stood there with his hat in his hand, as though he were attending something important and did not want to miss a moment of it, had become the most important witness of her life. Not because he had watched, because after watching, he had stayed. They put Thomas to bed early that evening and then sat up late together, the way they did when the farm was quiet and there was no particular urgency, and the evening stretched out pleasantly. They talked about adding a second field rotation the following year, about whether to sell at the Abilene market or the closer one at Ellsworth, about a letter from Gilbert's sister in St. Louis that had hinted she was considering a visit that summer, which Georgia had responded to enthusiastically because she liked what she knew of a woman willing to travel to Kansas in July on a whim. Clara slept in the cradle beside them. Thomas slept in his room with one of Gilbert's old books under his arm, which was a habit he had developed and that no one had the heart to discourage. When the lamp burned low, Gilbert reached over and took George's hand the way he always did, unhurriedly and without announcement, as though it were the most natural motion available to him, and perhaps it was. "I've been thinking," he said. "About what?" she said. "About building a proper barn," he said. The current structure is fine, but it's not big enough for what we're doing now, and if we add the second field rotation and keep the dairy side growing, we'll need the space. She considered this practically. Spring would be the right time to start. I thought so too, he said. We could have it framed by summer. It's a good idea, she said. I thought you'd say that, he said. She looked at him sideways with a slight smile. You usually do know what I'm going to say. Not always, he said. Sometimes you surprise me. Good, she said. I'd like to keep doing that. He lifted her hand and pressed it briefly to his lips, a simple gesture, unhurried, and she leaned against his shoulder. And outside the window the Kansas night was enormous and full of stars, and the farm was quiet, and everything was exactly as it should be, exactly as she had planted it. Georgia Atwood, who had come to Kansas at 22 with someone else's plans and had spent the years since making her own, looked out at the dark field and felt the deep particular contentment of a person who has arrived, after a long and difficult journey, precisely where they meant to go. She had not meant to go here. She had meant to go to Kansas, which she had done. The rest of it had grown up around her the way good things grow, not according to a blueprint, but according to what the ground would support, and what the season allowed, and what two people, tending the same plot of earth with the same care and the same stubbornness, could bring in together. She was 32 years old, and she had a farm that was hers and a husband who loved her as she was, and two children sleeping in the rooms behind her, and a cornfield that had been planted and harvested 4 times now and would be planted again in the morning. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The lamp guttered and Gilbert trimmed the wick and the light steadied again, warm and sufficient, and they stayed up a little while longer in the quiet house on the Kansas plains, talking about nothing in particular and everything that mattered, while the stars turned slowly overhead and the night insects made their small continuous music in the dark, and the land waited patiently outside, ready to be worked again, ready to give what it had to give, to the people who knew it well enough to ask.